What happens when a journalist known for his ruthless wit singles out Barron Trump at a high-profile charity gala? He expected laughter, maybe applause, but what he got instead was a moment that no one in the room would ever forget. The Regent Grand Ballroom in New York City was bathed in golden light, the air buzzing with conversation as some of the most powerful figures in politics, business, and media gathered for the Hope for Tomorrow charity gala. It was a night meant for celebration, not controversy. Seated at a discreet table near the back was Barron Trump. At 18, he had grown into a tall, poised young man, his quiet confidence making him stand out even without trying. Unlike his father, he avoided the limelight, preferring instead to observe. But tonight, the spotlight would find him, whether he wanted it or not. The evening's keynote speaker, James Calloway, a celebrated political journalist, took the stage. He was known for his sharp humor, often walking the fine line between bold and cruel. Some admired him, others feared him, but no one expected what he would say next. His opening jokes were harmless, quips about New York traffic and past gala mishaps. Laughter rippled through the room, but then his tone changed. "Of course," Calloway smirked, "we can't talk about America's most powerful families without mentioning the Trumps." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some chuckled, others tensed. Barron didn't move. Calloway continued, voice laced with sarcasm. "Imagine growing up in a golden tower, surrounded by marble floors and billion-dollar deals, while the rest of us are just trying to survive our morning coffee. That must build character, right?" Scattered laughter. A few nervous glances. Then he looked directly at Barron. "And of course there's Barron Trump, the mystery Trump. No social media, no public statements. What's the secret, kid? Are you training to be the next Batman, or just waiting for Dad to hand you the White House keys?" This time the laughter was hesitant. People glanced at Barron, expecting a reaction, but he gave none. He simply sat still, his hands resting lightly on the table, expression unreadable. The room shifted. Something unspoken passed between the guests. Even Calloway seemed to sense it, but it was too late to take it back, because Barron Trump was about to respond, and his words would leave the entire ballroom in stunned silence. A hush fell over the room. The laughter that had once filled the ballroom now hung in the air like a heavy cloud, suffocating and awkward. All eyes were on Barron Trump. Most young men his age would have shrunk under the weight of the moment, their cheeks flushing with embarrassment. But Barron, he didn't even blink. He simply sat there, tall and composed, his expression eerily calm. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Even James Calloway, the seasoned journalist who had built a career on bold statements, seemed to sense something had shifted. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably at the podium. "Tough crowd," he muttered into the microphone, forcing a chuckle. Still, Barron didn't move. Then he pushed back his chair. The soft scrape of wood against the marble floor was the only sound in the massive ballroom. And then he stood. At just over 6 feet tall, Barron was an imposing figure, his presence alone commanding attention. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to look angry. He simply looked determined. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped away from his table and walked toward the stage. Each step was measured, controlled, powerful. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their anticipation palpable. Even Calloway's usual smirk had faded, his confident demeanor cracking ever so slightly as Barron approached. He hadn't expected this, no one had. When Barron reached the edge of the stage, he didn't immediately take the microphone. Instead, he locked eyes with Calloway, holding his gaze with an intensity that made even the most hardened guests shift in their seats, and then he spoke. "Thank you for your insight." His voice was deep and steady, each word deliberate. There was no anger, no mockery, just an unsettling calm that made his response even more powerful. "I've grown up watching people like you make assumptions about me, my family, my life," Barron continued. "It's become something of a game, hasn't it? A way to fill in the blanks when you don't know the full story." The room was dead silent. Even those who had chuckled earlier now sat frozen, their expressions unreadable. "I understand," Barron went on, his voice unwavering. "We're public figures. We expect scrutiny. We expect criticism. It's part of the deal." He paused, then added, "But what people forget, what people like you often ignore, is that behind every name, Behind every headline, behind every punchline, there's a real person. A human being with their own struggles, their own dreams, and their own story. Calloway's face had lost its smug confidence. He swallowed, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium. Barron tilted his head slightly, his eyes still locked onto the journalists. "You may think you know me because of who my father is," he said, his tone soft but firm. "But you don't. Not really." A murmur ran through the crowd. The shift in the atmosphere was unmistakable. Barron Trump had just taken control of the room, and he wasn't finished yet. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They had expected Barron to ignore the jab, maybe force a smile and move on. But instead, he was standing right there, unshaken, commanding the room with nothing more than his presence and carefully chosen words. The journalist, James Calloway, shifted at the podium. He had spent decades in media, debating world leaders, taking on controversial topics without hesitation. Yet, in this moment, under the weight of Barron's unwavering gaze, he looked uncertain. Barron took a step closer, his expression calm but firm. There was no anger, no sarcasm, just a quiet authority that made every word feel heavier. "There's something I've learned over the years," Barron continued, his voice steady. "Respect doesn't have to be earned. It should be given freely, especially when you don't know someone's full story." The statement hung in the air. Some in the crowd exchanged glances while others sat motionless, captivated. "We live in a time where tearing each other down has become entertainment," Barron said, his tone carrying an unmistakable weight. "Words are thrown around carelessly, disguised as jokes, but they leave a mark." He glanced around the room, making eye contact with different people, business moguls, politicians, celebrities, many of whom had built their own legacies on controversy, on bold opinions, on pushing boundaries. "But words also have the power to do something else," he added. "They can build, they can heal, they can unite, and I think we could all use a little more of that." A murmur ran through the crowd. Something was shifting. Calloway, still gripping the podium, let out a forced chuckle. "Well, young man, I certainly didn't expect a philosophy lesson tonight," he said, attempting to lighten the mood. "But I'll give you credit, you've got a way with words." Barron didn't flinch. He simply gave a small, knowing nod. "I hope they give you something to think about," he said simply. The weight of those words was undeniable. Calloway knew it. The crowd knew it. And then Barron turned. With the same quiet confidence, he walked back toward his seat. But the moment wasn't over yet, because as he sat down, something unexpected happened. A single clap echoed from the front of the room, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, erupting into a thunderous standing ovation. Some clapped out of admiration, others out of sheer respect for the way this young man had just handled himself. But all of them, every single person in that room, knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. James Calloway, still standing at the podium, looked out at the audience, his confident smirk now completely gone. For the first time in his career, he had been outclassed. Not by a politician, not by a rival journalist, but by an 18-year-old who had just given the room a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And the night wasn't over yet. The standing ovation continued, a wave of applause that swept through the grand ballroom. Some guests clapped with admiration, others with a sense of discomfort, a silent acknowledgement that Barron Trump had just turned the tables on one of the most respected journalists in the country. James Calloway stood frozen at the podium, his usual charisma suddenly absent. He glanced down at his notes, as if searching for a way to regain control of the moment. But there was no coming back from this. Barron Trump had just done something that very few could. He had silenced an entire room with nothing but grace and wisdom beyond his years. As the applause slowly died down, Calloway cleared his throat, forcing a small chuckle. "Well," he said, gripping the edges of the podium, "I think it's safe to say that young Mr. Trump has mastered the art of public speaking." A few polite chuckles rippled through the audience. But the energy in the room had shifted. People weren't laughing at Barron anymore, they were listening. Barron remained seated, his expression unreadable. He had made his point, not with anger, not with insults, but with composure that left the entire room speechless. Calloway exhaled, trying to recover. He was used to having the final word, to controlling the narrative. But tonight, The narrative had been taken from him. Realizing he had no way to dismiss what had just happened, he tried a different approach. "You know," he said, attempting to keep his voice light, "I may have underestimated you, Barron. I expected a quiet young man in the back of the room, not someone who could hold their own in front of a crowd." Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And maybe," Calloway continued, "there's something to be said about the way you handled that moment. I'll admit, I threw a jab your way. Maybe it was too far." The crowd watched, waiting. Was this an apology? A half-hearted attempt to save face? Barron leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm. "Or maybe you should ask yourself why you felt the need to do it in the first place." Silence. Calloway froze. The journalist, who had spent years challenging politicians, questioning authority, and pushing boundaries, had just been given a question he couldn't answer. The audience shifted in their seats. Some sipped their drinks awkwardly. Others stole glances at one another. This was no longer just a moment of embarrassment for Calloway. It was a moment of reflection for everyone in that room. Barron's words weren't just for Calloway. They were for everyone who had ever used their platform to tear someone down. Calloway forced a tight-lipped smile. "Fair point," he muttered, adjusting his tie. "Maybe we all have some things to think about." Barron didn't respond. He didn't need to, because tonight his silence had been louder than words, and the night wasn't over yet. As Barron leaned back in his seat, the weight of his words still hanging in the air, something unexpected happened. A woman from the front row, a well-known philanthropist, stood up. She was in her 60s, a respected figure in the world of charity and advocacy. She glanced around the room, then turned her attention toward Calloway. "You know," she said, her voice steady, "this young man just taught us all something we should have learned a long time ago." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others sat stiffly, uncertain of what would come next. "Respect isn't something we should demand. It's something we should give," she continued. "We spend so much time tearing each other down, turning everything into a spectacle. But what did Barron do? He didn't lash out, he didn't humiliate. He simply held up a mirror and let us see ourselves." The room was eerily quiet. Then, one by one, other guests stood up. A businessman near the center of the ballroom rose, adjusting his cufflinks. "I've been to a lot of these galas," he said, his voice thoughtful, "and I can tell you this is the first time I've left one actually thinking about how I can be better." More voices joined in. "I came here tonight expecting another round of political jabs and media theatrics," another guest admitted. "Instead, I saw a young man show more wisdom than people twice his age." The room was changing. The once dismissive smirks, the whispered jokes, they were gone. Instead, there was a collective realization that something real had just happened. Even Calloway, who had spent a lifetime crafting narratives, looked down, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Regret? Humility? No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain. The entire gala had transformed. The air no longer buzzed with empty laughter or rehearsed conversations. Instead, it carried something much deeper, a sense of reflection, of accountability. And at the heart of it all sat Barron Trump, unshaken, unbothered, and entirely in control of the moment. And soon, the world would know what had just happened. By the time the gala ended, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had started as a night of routine speeches and expected jabs had become something far more meaningful, a moment of self-reflection that no one would forget. As guests trickled out, some deep in thought, others quietly discussing what had just unfolded, Barron remained as he had all evening, calm, composed, and entirely at peace. Outside the Fairmont Grand Hotel, reporters waited eagerly for sound bites, expecting the usual gossip from a high-profile event. But what they got instead was something entirely different. Within hours, social media was flooded with videos from the gala. Attendees, stunned by the maturity and grace Barron had displayed, shared clips of his response. It went viral almost instantly. Barron Trump just gave the classiest response of the year. This young man handled it better than most adults ever could. A masterclass in dignity and composure. Whether you support his family or not, you have to respect this. Even mainstream media, often divided in their opinions, couldn't ignore the sheer impact of what had happened. Talk shows, news segments, and opinion pieces dissected the moment not just as a story about a political family, but as a lesson in grace under fire. The most surprising reaction, however, came from Calloway himself. 2 days later, in a rare move, he appeared on national television and addressed what had happened. "I've built a career on pushing boundaries, and sometimes I push too far," he admitted. But that night, Barron Trump reminded me, and all of us, that class isn't about winning an argument. It's about how you treat people even when they don't deserve it. For Barron, though, life went on as usual. He didn't bask in the attention or issue any follow-ups. He didn't respond to the praise or the debates that raged online because he never needed to. His actions had already spoken louder than any statement ever could. And in a world where anger and outrage often dominate, his quiet strength left a lasting imprint on millions. What can we take from this? In a time when so many rush to attack, to ridicule, to tear each other down, what would happen if we chose to rise above instead? Barron Trump's story isn't just about one night at a gala. It's a reminder that true strength isn't found in insults or retaliation. It's found in dignity, in restraint, and in the simple choice to meet cruelty with grace. So, the next time you face criticism or mockery, ask yourself, how will you respond? Because sometimes the most powerful response is simply rising above. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more real-life moments that challenge, uplift, and remind us all of the power of kindness. Let's keep the conversation going.